His empire collapsed in fire and betrayal, and his flesh was the first to pay the price. Ashina Helu, once Khagan of the Western Turkic Khaganate, was a man who clawed his way to power through war, deceit, and blood. He ruled through ambition and cruelty, only to be undone by his own generals, his own court, and his own kin. When the Chinese crushed his final rebellion, they delivered him to the very men he had once commanded, and those men flayed him alive. The wind on the steppe did not forgive. It sliced through flesh like tempered bronze, howling against yurts and bones alike. Long before his body was broken and his skin peeled from muscle like rotted hide, Ashina Helu had already been hollowed out from within. His name, once muttered with reverence in the shadowed courts of the Western Turks, grew heavier with every betrayal it buried. He was born into the Ashina clan, but not into comfort or certainty. His father died young, his mother disgraced, and Helu's early years were spent under the thin roof of exile, where snow crept through felt seams and shame festered like infection beneath frost-bitten nails. Even then, his eyes glinted with a hunger that was not human. It was the kind of hunger that devoured brothers in their sleep and learned early the taste of blood drawn from kin. Helu returned from exile in silence, like a wolf returning to a half-abandoned den, half-starved and full of purpose. He did not rise through honor, but through corrosion. At banquets, he smiled with poisoned lips. At councils, he whispered doubts that curdled alliances into feuds. He accused cousins of consorting with demons. He bribed priests to cast false omens. In 651, when the throne of the Western Turkic Khaganate stood vulnerable, cracked by infighting and weakened by famine, Helu took it not with glory, but with a dagger in a tent and a funeral with no mourners. He declared himself Khagan, heaven-favored, by his own mouth. He wore robes stitched with crimson thread, boots lined with fox fur, and a belt carved from the ribs of a slain enemy. Around his neck, he wore a talisman carved from human bone, inscribed with symbols that no priest dared translate aloud. He commissioned sacrifices of white stallions and burnt offerings that reeked of more than just flesh. The temples smoked for days, and the skies did not clear. His court glimmered on the surface, golden bowls, silk tapestries, dancers with henned skin and empty eyes. But beneath the furs and fragrance lay a rot that stung the nostrils. Servants walked barefoot over rushes soaked in spilt blood. Messengers carried scrolls with trembling hands, knowing one misstep meant skinning or impalement. One man, an envoy from the eastern tribes, was flayed for arriving a day late. His skin was hung outside the palace gates like a banner of warning, his mouth frozen in a final scream that vultures cleaned clean. Helu trusted no one, and so ruled through terror. The 10 tribes that made up his realm, the Karluks, the Koyu, the Tusi, the Basmals, and others, were played against each other like pieces in a rigged game. Tribal chieftains were summoned, made drunk, and vanished. In their place, Helu appointed cousins, lovers, sycophants, anyone whose loyalty could be ensured by fear or gold. Those who questioned were accused of conspiracy, and the charges were always true, even when fabricated. Yet the decay was not silent. In the highlands, whispers grew thick. Shamans spoke of ill omens in the entrails of sacrificed goats. The sky darkened before midday. Children were born with no eyes, and mothers dreamed of wolves without fur gnawing their own legs. When thunder cracked over the steppes, old men muttered that Tengri, the god of the sky, had turned his gaze away. But Helu, seated on his blood-polished throne, laughed at warnings. He rode out to war against the Tang dynasty in 657, with banners high and drums struck with bone-covered mallets. He believed no one would dare move against him, not his soldiers, not his allies, not even the gods. He did not see the way his generals glanced at each other in silence. He did not notice the tightening lips, the hands that hovered near blades. He did not feel the shifting wind until it howled behind him, carrying not the scent of war, but the stench of something worse, betrayal ripening. What Ashina Helu never understood was this: a man can build an empire on fear, but he cannot die in peace upon it. His throne was not carved from unity, but from gristle, stitched together with old blood, and promises no one intended to keep. and when the wolves came for him, they were his own. The first sign of death was not blood, but silence. Not the silence of victory or defeat, but the eerie, cavernous hush that follows when men stop obeying. When the battlefield still roared with hooves and steel, Ashina Helu turned in his saddle and saw the truth. The banners of his tribal levies were not advancing. They were vanishing, pulled down mid-charge, abandoned in the slush. Some were trampled beneath their own fleeing riders, their symbols crushed into mud and bone. Others simply broke and scattered, as if the wind had whispered that their Khagan's blessings were ashes and his gods deaf. The Chinese line, tight as an iron comb, pressed forward in methodical precision. General Su Dingfeng's Tang troops did not scream or taunt. They advanced like machines, shields slick with frost, arrows loosed in geometric volleys. It was during one of those volleys that Helu's right shoulder exploded, not from a spear or sword, but a black-feathered Tang arrow that punched through sinew, bone, and the lining of his ribcage in a single wet crack. He stayed upright by force of habit, blood coursing down his side in warmth that quickly turned icy beneath armor, laced with animal fat and ceremonial charms. A second arrow missed him. A third struck his horse. The beast collapsed with a shriek, snapping a leg beneath its own weight and hurling its rider into the churned snow. The Khagan did not wait for help. There was none. By twilight, he was crawling north, shoulder torn, teeth clenched, so hard they cracked enamel, breath rasping against the blood in his lungs. No healer came. No loyal tribesman sought him out in the dark. He was alone, half dragging himself over brittle grass and ice-thin streams, clutching his wound with a strip torn from his own robe, black silk soaked crimson. The arrowhead remained lodged within. Every jolt, every stumble drove it deeper. The cold arrived before the wolves did. As night fell over the mountains, the air turned cruel. It gnawed through his garments and filled his bones with splinters. His fingers, numbed first by shock, turned rigid with frostbite. The tips blistered white and waxy. He tried to light a fire with his belt flint, but his hands no longer closed properly. His breath came in shallow puffs, each laced with pink froth. He drank from shallow hollows in the snow, lapping like a dying animal, each gulp freezing the lining of his throat. By the second day, fever took hold. He muttered to himself in broken invocations, half prayers to Tengri, half curses at ancestors long dead. The arrow wound had gone soft at the edges, a glistening oval of rot, purple at the margins, with a slick of yellow pus each time he moved. Flies, drawn even in winter, nested in the blood-soaked cloth, laying eggs in warmth. He imagined voices, whispers behind the trees, warnings in the shrieks of circling crows. In one moment of clarity, he stood upright and screamed into the frozen sky, cursing the names of the tribal chieftains who had fled. His voice cracked mid-word, and he vomited blood and bile into the snow, staining it a streaked brown. The horse, his last mount, ribs cutting through its flanks like prison bars, collapsed near a ridge. Its legs shook violently, then buckled, spilling its rider beneath its weight. Helu tried to rise, but his arm no longer moved properly. The flesh beneath his wound was blackening, and the infection had spread across his chest, tight and hot, like burning hide. No fire, no food. For days he chewed bark from birch trees, sucking it until the fibers splintered his gums. His urine darkened, until it resembled ink. When he defecated, it was tar-black and sticky with blood. He stopped feeling his toes, then his feet entirely. His boots were stiff with frozen sweat and old blood. He feared removing them, knowing the skin beneath would slough off like wet leaves. By the fifth night, delirium bloomed fully. He saw figures in the snow, pale faces, some his victims, others his gods. A child with hollow eyes offered him a bowl of ash. His mother, long dead, stood silent beside a tree, her neck bruised by a rope that had never existed. He screamed for her to speak. She turned and walked into the darkness. Wolves circled him but did not attack. He was already theirs. They waited, patient, the way scavengers always wait for the skin to loosen from the bones. In that final stretch, the great Khagan of the Western Turks was not a man, not a warrior, not even an animal. He was rot walking, barely alive, praying with what remained of his lips that someone, anyone would find him before the worms did. And still, no one came. They found him near a frozen stream at dawn, curled against a dead tree. The snow around him stained a faint yellow-brown where his body had failed to hold its functions. His skin was gray at the edges, the wound on his shoulder bloated and pulsing with foul liquid, crawling with fat-bodied flies that should not have survived the frost. He was not asleep, he was muttering, lips torn from cold, whispering syllables that didn't form words, just fragments of curses and prayers, muddled by fever and pain. His eyes did not track movement, his fingers twitched without rhythm. The Tang soldiers who approached him did not raise their spears. They gagged. One stepped back and vomited. Another held a cloth to his face and muttered a prayer against unclean spirits. Even death, they agreed later, had fled from this man, not out of fear, but out of disgust. They did not offer comfort, they bound him immediately. Iron cords wrapped around his arms and legs, biting deep into skin that tore open with little resistance. The flesh beneath was black and slippery, as if decay had started while he still breathed. Every movement made him grunt, not with rage, but the dull, flat moan of a man who no longer knew where the pain began or if it had ever stopped. They tied him to a mule and dragged him, not even upright, face first through snow and gravel, slush packing into his ears, blood smearing behind like a worm's trail. His robes had long since fused with his skin in places. Strips of silk tore loose, revealing crusted sores, raw flesh, frost-bitten thighs. By the time he reached the Tang camp, there was no grandeur left in the Khagan, only rot. He was thrown to the ground near the war council tent, where the 10 tribes had already gathered, not in mourning or pity, but with cold hunger. Their emissaries stood in silence at first, forming a semicircle like stones encircling a pyre. Each had lost a brother, a son, a father, some to Helu's executions, others to starvation from his wars, others still to madness wrought by his tyrannical omens and blood rituals. When the Tang general gave the signal, they moved as one. The first man, gray-haired but strong, strode forward and slapped Helu so hard that teeth sprayed from his mouth in red foam. The second man pulled a rusted blade from his belt and without hesitation, hacked away a piece of Helu's long beard, not cutting it cleanly but sawing it off in chunks, leaving strips of skin torn beneath. One man spat into his face, another threw a clay jar of sheep dung that broke on his chest, seeping into the open wound under his ribs. No guards intervened. The ritual was permitted expected. One of the chieftains, a man whose son had been flayed alive under Helu's orders, dropped his trousers and urinated on the Khagan's bare feet. The urine hissed in the snow, steaming as it soaked into cracked flesh and frost-bitten bone. Helu flinched, but did not resist. He simply sat there, urine dripping down his toes, blood caked on his chin, eyes wide and unblinking. When asked to speak, he said nothing, not even when a child, dragged forward by his grieving mother, spat into his mouth and screamed, "You are no god, you're a ghost of shit." Only once did Helu weep, only when he lifted his eyes and saw the banners. Ash-gray cloth, frayed by wind, embroidered with the sigils of the 10 tribes. His tribes now flying alongside Tang colors, hoisted high with pride by warriors who once called him Khagan. He stared at them for a long time, face wet with filth, jaw trembling. His lips moved, but the words were not speech, just a choked wheeze, followed by a stream of drool and bile. They left him in the snow that night, not in a tent, not under guard, just shackled outside, his iron cords frozen to his skin, his back arched by pain, his body twitching in fever. His breath came in clouds, growing thinner with each hour. Somewhere nearby, a Tang monk recited sutras for the dying, soft, melodic, haunting in their gentleness. The words were meant to offer peace. Helu spat blood in their direction, a thick glob that steamed as it hit the ground, as if even now, something within him still refused to be purified. He slept that night with open eyes, and in his dreams, he heard the beating of war drums, soft at first, then louder, until they sounded like skin being stretched. The wind had turned by the time they gathered, cold and directionless. It stirred the ash-colored sky with sluggish gusts, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of watching Helu draw breath. The war camp had been stripped of ceremony, yet something older than empire filled the air, older than kingship, older than war, older even than gods spoken aloud. Beneath the stretched hides and soot-stained standards, the council took shape in a ring of silent figures wrapped in furs and smoke. 10 tribes, 10 stones. Each man who approached the center of the clearing carried in his arms a rough-cut slab of granite or shale, carved not with decoration, but with names. Brothers slain under Helu's purges, fathers beheaded on false charges, sons offered as sacrifices during his omens of drought and conquest. Some bore only one name, others were etched top to bottom, the script curling around the edge like a fevered scrawl. One stone had no letters, only a child's bloody handprint, dried and dark, sealed in time. Helu was dragged before them, not walking, not crawling, but pulled like slaughter weight. His feet left streaks in the snow, the soles cracked open and black from rot, his legs rigid from the cold, twitching now and then like a beast long past mercy. The chains had fused to his skin at the wrist and ankle. Each jolt tore away slivers of flesh, exposing pale muscle slick with frost and congealed blood. His face, once sharp and regal, had collapsed inward. The right eye was sealed shut beneath a purple swelling. The left flicked back and forth, unfocused, like a cornered animal blinking in smoke. There was no question, no trial, no defense. The chieftain of the Chiyu tribe stepped forward and spoke, not in anger, but in cadence, slow, heavy, ancestral. Blood must answer blood, skin must answer sin. One by one, the tribal voices rose, flat and resonant, like drums carved from hollow bone, chanting a litany, not of forgiveness, but remembrance. The names of the betrayed, the murdered, the vanished. Names spoken as if to summon their spirits from the dirt. Names spoken so the gods would listen. Then came the priest, barefoot, robed in horsehide and earth-stained linen. The man moved toward Helu with the gait of one who had done this before. In his hand a bowl of ochre, thick, iron-rich, made from crushed roots, dried blood, and sacred clay. With one trembling finger, he painted a spiral on Helu's forehead, then lines down each cheek, tracing paths like rivers, leading toward a mouth already dried and cracked open in confusion. He whispered, not gently, not with pity, but with venom, "You will not enter the sky. You will not be reborn. You will rot in shadow, skinless, seen by all, remembered by none." Helu said nothing, not until the verdict was read aloud, its words carved into the winter air with absolute, ritual precision. Let the traitor be skinned alive. Let the people take back what he wore. Let the wind dry his flesh. Let his hide serve as warning. And then, from the figure half slumped in the blood-stained snow, came a sound. Laughter. Not full-bodied, not defiant. A thin cracked chuckle, high-pitched, broken, bubbling with fluid caught in his throat. It did not rise. It leaked out of him like pus from a wound. A laughter stripped of sanity, emptied of context. The last instinct of a man who had long since accepted that no god would come, no sword would deliver quick death, and no crown would remain on his skull. The chieftains did not speak. None stepped forward to silence him. Instead, they turned away, not from mercy, but from disgust, and made the final preparations. Ropes were soaked in brine to toughen them. Knives were sharpened on bone. Drums were tightened. A fire was lit, not for warmth, but for purification. The execution would not be carried out in haste, nor in secret, nor by strangers. Each tribe had sent its butcher. Each blade was blessed. Each man would take a turn. Because this was no execution. It was a ritual. It was justice. It was the peeling of false divinity from mortal flesh. And Helu, who once named himself heaven-favored, would scream not to the gods, but to the sky that had abandoned him. The clearing reeked of burnt fat and horseblood, though no fire yet burned. The snow, which should have gleamed in soft dawn light, was instead blackened with ash and churned earth, pockmarked with bootprints and splattered blood from offerings made earlier in the night. Goat, dog, bird, all meant to prepare the ground for a greater sacrifice. Ashina Helu was dragged to the center by 4 men in silence. His body no longer resisted. There was no strength left to struggle, only a slow, jerking twitch in his legs, as if some dying nerve still misfired deep beneath the flesh. His wrists and ankles, mottled purple and green with infection, cracked and bled anew as the horsehair ropes were cinched around them. Rough, unwashed cords that hissed against raw skin like sandpaper dragged across open wounds. The poles had been driven deep into the frozen earth, firm and unyielding. Each was marked with a red-stained sigil representing one of the 10 tribes, half obliterated from age, not time but tradition. Every part of this had been done before, just not in living memory. Not for a man who had once been a king. They began at his thighs. The first blade was stone, sharpened to a sickening smoothness. Its edge, once used on deer and wolves, now met human skin with a sound that those present would never forget. A soft, wet hiss, like silk tearing underwater. It did not slice quickly. It scraped. It lifted. The edge slid beneath the surface and peeled upward with slow, relentless force, raising curls of skin that twisted like pale red ribbons in the cold air before slapping wetly to the ground. Helu screamed only once. It was not a word, not a cry for mercy, not even a curse. It was an animal sound, high, cracking, full of wetness, and it ended abruptly when he choked on the spit and blood that flooded into his throat. His tongue was too swollen to move. His lips cracked like shattered porcelain. He coughed, vomited, and retched all at once, the bile freezing as it struck the snow. One of the executioners turned away and gagged. Another made the sign of the sky god with trembling fingers. Neither spoke. The elders had ordered silence. They worked methodically, in shifts, each man assigned a limb, a quadrant of flesh. Brine was poured from clay vessels at intervals, meant not only to prevent infection, but to ensure he did not faint. The salt hissed when it hit the open muscle, sending violent spasms through his frame that made the poles creak under tension. His body arched, twisted, then sagged, again and again. By mid-morning, his legs had been fully stripped, the muscle beneath exposed in glistening cords of red and white, twitching with each shift of breath. The snow around him had melted into a dark, steaming mire of blood, sweat and waste. Flies, inexplicably, thriving even in the cold, buzzed low to the ground, drawn by the scent. Children were brought forward, not for cruelty's sake, but for memory. Each tribe had sent one, aged between 8 and 12, to watch what became of tyrants. The youngest, a girl with frost-bitten cheeks, asked her father if it was really him. Yes, the elder replied, without looking away. That is what remains when a man eats his own people. As noon passed, they moved to his arms. The wrists proved difficult, skin there was thin and scarred, and Helu thrashed so violently the rope bit down to bone. The executioners bound his jaw shut with sinew to silence the screaming. Still he moaned through clenched teeth, an inhuman hum that sounded more like a hive of hornets trapped in a corpse. His chest came last. They waited until the light had dimmed, until shadow fell across his face, and the steam from his open flesh no longer rose. The skin was looser now. Heat and cold had softened it. It peeled back with a sickening ease, like wet bark from a dead tree. Beneath, his heart still beat, slow, visible, bare, and finally, his face. They did not ask him to speak. He could not. His eyes rolled back as the blade touched his cheekbone. The first slice began at the jawline, and rose to the temple, peeling the skin away from the skull in a single long curl that flapped in the wind. No expression remained, no human recognition, just red. When they stepped back at last, as dusk fell over the mountain ridge, there was no one left to execute. Helu had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a figure of glistening, flayed meat, lashed to poles, steaming in the wind. His blood had formed a black pool beneath him, freezing in patches, crusting in others. One elder removed his fur cloak and placed it over a child's shoulders. "Now," he said softly, "the gods can see what we have done." Helu's body did not move again, but his eyes, clouded, frozen, lidless, remained open, watching nothing, watching everything. By the time the body cooled, it was no longer flesh in the human sense. no longer prince or predator or tyrant, but a red mass glazed with frost and grime, fibers stiffened into a grotesque exoskeleton beneath the settling snow. Helu's mouth, torn at the corners, gaped like a wound that had forgotten what speech was. His ribcage, exposed, skinless and trembling from the last vestiges of life, stood out like the wreckage of a collapsed temple, each bone coated in a thin sheen of brine and dried blood. There were no rites, no funeral chants, no procession of mourning retainers. What remained of the Khagan's body was hacked from the poles with cleavers dulled by hours of butchery. The joints were dislocated not for burial preparation, but for easier disposal, knees twisted backward, arms twisted until tendons popped. The neck snapped with a final crack that echoed across the clearing like the breaking of some final, ancient oath. They did not bury him. A pit had already been dug, not deep, but wide, rimmed with frozen earth and lined with a coarse slurry of dried reeds and ox fat. The stench that rose from it was thick and oily, promising a burn that would not bless, only consume. Helu's body was tossed in without ceremony. One of the elders threw in the blackened cloth that had once covered his royal throne. Another spat after it, then lit the fire with a torch dipped in pitch and ash. The flames rose fast. The ox fat sizzled and hissed, coating the rising smoke with a smell so pungent that those standing nearby turned their faces and wrapped their cloaks around their mouths. Flesh peeled in layers, bone cracked open with wet pops. The torso caved in on itself. His jaw clattered once, loose and skeletal, before falling silent forever. But one part of him was preserved. Before the burning, before the butchers arrived, a special group of tanners, chosen not by rank, but by steadiness of hand and hardness of mind, had carefully removed Helu's skin in its entirety. They had treated it like a prize kill, soaking it in lye to separate remaining fat, scraping it down with bone knives, then stretching it taut across a wooden frame to dry under smoke. The smell was unbearable, but they worked through it, silent, methodical, not as artisans but as instruments of memory. The result was no mere hide, it was Helu. His back, still bearing lash marks from his capture. His arms, notched from decades of war. His face, collapsed and vacant, was not kept. It had torn too badly. But the rest was there, his neck, his chest, even his genitals. All dried, flattened, and eventually cut into shape, not for display, but for a purpose that merged vengeance and ritual into one grim object. A great frame was carved from yew, hollowed and ringed with iron studs. Helu's skin, now yellow-gray and stiff, was stretched across it and nailed down. It shrank to fit, taut, dry, resonant. When struck with a mallet, wrapped in goat hide, it produced a dull, thunderous boom, heavy and sickening, like the sound of earth closing over a mass grave. Warriors of the 10 tribes would beat it before battle, not as music, but as invocation. "This is what betrayal sounds like," they whispered. Some said the sound made the Tang horses buck in terror. Others said it made grown men vomit in their helmets. Helu's skull, bleached and brittle, was smashed with a warhammer and cast into the nearest river. The villagers downriver claimed the water frothed for 3 days, white bubbles rising like breath from something drowned but still moving. No one fetched water during that time. Fishermen refused to cast nets. Children were told to stay indoors, and so his name disappeared, not erased, but transformed. It became a word mothers used to silence crying infants. Helu is watching, a word whispered intense, when someone grew too bold, too arrogant, too cruel. A name that was no longer a name, but a curse, unskinned, unspoken, unforgettable. He was gone, but the drums still echoed. After Helu's execution in 658, the Western Turkic Khaganate fractured completely. The Tang dynasty absorbed the region, installing puppet rulers and erasing Helu's lineage from records. The tribes that once feared him now turned against one another in power struggles, their temporary unity dissolving into blood feuds. For centuries, Helu's end remained a grim legend. Chinese historians wrote of his fall with disdain. Turkic oral traditions turned him into a ghost, restless, skinless, trapped between realms. His fate became a parable for warlords who rose too fast, too high, and ruled by fear. The skin remembers.